Hello and welcome back to the AI Ethics Now podcast. My name is Dr. Tom Ritchie and I'm really pleased today to be joined by Imogen Canavan. Hi Imogen,
Hello.
how you doing?
I am well, thank you, and delighted to be here.
Amazing, thank you so much. Could you tell us a little bit more about your role and what brings you to the topic of AI, please?
Sure, absolutely. So, I am a legal consultant. I have a background for the last 10 years in international human rights law. So, I have spent some time working at the UN and for different NGOs in Europe. So, that's a little bit about what I've been doing and how I ended up in AI. Well, it wasn't deliberate. I fell into this, as many of us are encountering AI in our work. And I would like to elaborate on that. But basically, we are seeing AI tools being used in the context of human rights cases. And specifically, I want to talk to you today about migration.
Brilliant and really interesting, I think, from your perspective that you didn't plan to come into AI, but you've adapted to it. So Imogen, how does bias in AI systems perpetuate existing inequalities?
It makes me wonder, what are the existing inequalities that you're speaking about? And in the context of human rights law and forced migration, which I'm going to define for you, we need to expand on what we mean by that. So, when we think about refugees and forced migration, we're really talking about people who are fleeing conflict or persecution. And we can look at the 1951 Refugee Convention definition, which defines people fleeing persecution from grounds of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, and the membership of a social group. But this is quite a narrow definition. Some people argue, so we could expand this. So, in this context, we're talking about people who are inherently already being persecuted. So, I would argue this is far more than an inequality. And when we think about the use of AI in this context, we need to think about who are the actors involved. And we have an inherent imbalance between refugees and forced migrants and the state who is going to receive them. So already we can see there are vulnerabilities of these people on the basis of the persecution, or arguably you could say climate change and other definition parts of the definition. But also, there are vulnerabilities and inequalities in the power dynamic. And then there is obviously the process, the very dangerous, sometimes process of reaching a country of safety. And so AI really can be used in this context in a number of different ways. So I have put together a list of some of the different ways that AI technologies are being used in this context. So, one is making risk assessments and profiling refugees before they arrive in a particular country, the processing of visas, travel authorization, and citizenship applications, identity verification, as well as fraud detection. And we see technologies being used for behavior and emotion recognition, speech recognition, and controversially, mobile phone data extraction. There are other ways as well. This is just a few examples of the kind of context in which we're seeing AI emerge in relation to migrants. And the types of technology that we're seeing, and I'm not a technical person, but what we are seeing is automated decision making, document and biometric verification, transcription, lie detection, speech and dialect recognition, and mobile phone data analysis. And I want to direct your students to the work of Dr. Daria Ozkol, who is also, she's based at the University of Oxford, but I believe she's also an assistant professor at Warwick University, and she's done some fantastic research at the Oxford Refugee Studies Centre on automating immigration and asylum, the uses of new technology in migration and asylum governance in Europe. So when we think about the use of this different types of technology, we want to think about the actors involved. So I already mentioned we have these arguably vulnerable individuals, and then we have these states who are being asked to receive them on the basis of their political will. So there's already, as I mentioned, this asymmetrical power relationship. And we want to think about how technology can contribute or not to this process. And so when we think about biases, Obviously, there's the well-known criticism that there's already bias in the system, and if we feed in that data to an AI system, it will be exacerbated. So that's a pretty common criticism that you will have seen, and it does apply in this context. So the first example I'd like to give you is let's start at home. So in the UK, in 2015, the UK Home Office introduced an algorithm to classify visit visas. Applicants were categorized by their nationality, and some nationalities were considered suspect by the algorithm. Now, obviously, this is highly controversial and was challenged in the courts by civil society on the basis of it being discriminatory against specific nationalities, which is not permitted under the Equality Act in the UK. And effectively, the government ceased to use the algorithm because obviously it was highly controversial and criticized, and they may have lost in the courts, but they withdrew the algorithm in August 2020 prior to a decision in the courts. So we don't have any case law on this for the lawyers listening. But I would say this is a really interesting example, but also speaks to the opaqueness. So we didn't know that certain nationalities were being discriminated against in the algorithm until investigations were undertaken by civil society. This was obviously not how the government presented the algorithm. But on the other hand, it's a really good example of how we need different members of society to look at how algorithms are being used. So another thing to consider is who's designing these systems. So these systems are often being designed, as you know, by big corporations and companies, private companies, who often come from a specific demographic and have a particular background. And usually that's not human rights. And they are being employed by governments who have their own backgrounds and interests to develop these systems. I would also add some international organizations have also been using AI technology, but to a far lesser degree. And we want to think about, again, about the people who this is supposed to serve. So in my opinion, a lot of the biases are emanating from this context, in the sense that they are unconscious biases, they're not deliberate, and they are because we are not thinking about all of the users of the system, and in the end, having a broad definition of who should benefit from the system. So I want to give you another example. So in 2016, there was a project introduced within the EU, specifically in Hungary, Greece, and Latvia. Now, it was just a trial, this was never officially rolled out, where personalized avatar agents were introduced to interview migrants. And the role of these was to assess the risk of the migrant and the truthfulness of what they were saying. And they were computer animated avatars which were personalized to each migrant. So they were the same gender as the migrant, they spoke the same language, and they were supposed to effectively reflect the person they were talking to. Now, on the one hand, that could be somewhat more comfortable for the individual to speak to an avatar which they feel perhaps reflected them. However, you can argue that a lot of these people are coming from societies that don't have access to technology. They often are not educated in this area, so they're not familiar with using this technology. So although it's perhaps supposed to help people and encourage them to share, that could be quite dehumanizing.
I think that's a really interesting example, particularly you've alluded to like the digital divide, which is something that is an undercurrent for all of this discussion around AI and AI usage for different groups around the world, where we know the issues with training data and a lot of it is unconscious, that it kind of inherent biases are being multiplied.
No, absolutely. And I mean, this is rife in this context, of course. So one of the big challenges we face is that the language is available. So if I go back to the example about these avatar agents, they were effectively designed to monitor and analyze the facial expressions and emotions of the individuals who are coming. Now, who designed these systems? As you say, these were Western designed, European designed ideas of facial recognition and of behavior. And effectively, there are other considerations as well, in particular for this category, which are these are traumatized people. So they don't necessarily, when you have trauma, you don't necessarily respond how people, in inverted commas, expect you to. And so, how do we calculate that in this as well? And so this divide not only shows that the problem stems in part again from who's designing the system and what information is going in. And so when we think about it in the context of people who are inherently coming from a different context, how do we calculate that into the design of the system? And it does, of course, exacerbate biases because how do we interpret human behavior? That's a really difficult question. And I can just give you one simple example from the context of my regular kind of non-AI work, which is when I'm preparing an asylum seeker or somebody for an interview, depending on which country is interviewing them, I prepare them differently. So for example, if they are being interviewed in the US Embassy in a particular country, I would work with them to maintain eye contact. That's something which is deemed really important in those interviews. But if I was preparing them for perhaps another European country, I would not. So how does that, distinction come into play when training an AI system? This is very specific knowledge, which is very difficult to put in.
I think that links to the idea of, you've mentioned about some of the culturally bound factors, and I think that they're really interesting, particularly in relation to AI and what is acceptable in one context perhaps isn't in another with eye contact. But also, you touched upon the concept of almost trauma-informed approaches, and actually that AI needs to take that trauma-informed approach, but that trauma is culturally bound. As you said, when thinking about refugees specifically, does any AI that works with refugees, can it understand the experience of fleeing a country? I don't know if it can, and it's a really interesting thing, I think, for you to raise, particularly as well as the biases that come with it. I wonder, Imogen, if in your work you've seen, what steps can be taken to address some of these biases in AI development and deployment as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So thinking about the biases that we have and we need to address, I mean, first and foremost, the biases that come from AI come from us. So what the real question is, what biases do we have as human beings, first and foremost? Although AI is exciting, it's new, it's kind of the sexy topic at the moment. But what I would say is, we still apply the same methodologies. I remember when the internet was rolled out. So, and we have to think about how do we create a safe space where we can gain as many advantages as possible. So when we try to address these biases, then we want to think about who's designing this, as I said before. So who has the money, the money to design this technology? It's expensive to invest in one of these systems. And of course, we can all benefit from the expedited processes, the reduced future costs, because you have less human personnel, things are faster. But in the end, it's a huge amount of investment to set this up. So one of the things is to make this technology more accessible. How do we make it more open source? How do we make it so that not only governments are rolling this out, but also NGOs can use it, caseworkers can use it, refugees or forced migrants themselves can use it. How can AI be used by everybody and be designed by everyone? So what about the consultation processes when designing this? How do you involve different actors and ensure that the different perspectives of the different people are contributing to the design and implementation and assessment? And the reason why I say those with particular emphasis is because we need these systems to be transparent in order for us to be able to assess if they're working, to be able to improve them. And they need to be transparent not only to the people who design them, but also to the users and to the people who are benefiting them and their advocates in the particular context of sometimes some of my clients are illiterate. So how do they assess this? And their input is equally important as somebody who is a user and hopefully a beneficiary of these systems. But how do we make that accessible?
I think that's a really important point, and you've touched on this, the idea of accessibility, but there's also the challenge of explainability and being able to almost open the black box that exists sometimes within different AI projects. And I think in the context of your work with refugees and forced migrants, that's such a huge question of, can we understand exactly how this has reached this decision, and is that fair, is that balanced, is that equitable? And that's a real challenge, I think, with that we're finding that the more complex AI systems are getting, the more difficult that explainability factor is becoming. And something we're talking to our students a lot about on the module is, regardless of their home discipline, the ability to communicate AI in whatever they're doing, and communicate the impact, the value, and actually how the AI is working. That's going to be a key skill moving forward.
100%. And the understanding that you need to have, it means we need to all be working on the same definition of AI, because I adopt a very broad definition. When we talk about AI, I'm also including algorithms and kind of other forms of technology. But not everyone does. So we need to make sure we all have a common understanding of what we're talking about. But there are other things we need to do and be careful about too when we think about explainability. So we want to also think about data. So who owns data? Now, in the context, again, of migration, this data is incredibly precious, because we're trying to verify who somebody is and what they are saying is true. And often the things they are saying are true are allegations made against a state that might be persecuting them or someone else. So this is sensitive data. And how do we ensure this data is protected and only used for the purposes which we intend it to be used for, with the consent of the person whose data it belongs to? So these are really important questions, and particularly when you have AI models where data is being fed in to a model, that's one of the things that's held me back from using AI in my work, is because of I cannot enter private data into a public AI system, or a system where it's accessible. And big companies can develop their own internal AI models, but a lot of small civil society organizations cannot. And so this is an inhibition again, and what we spoke about before with open source data too. So when we think about regulation, of course, we've got the recent AI Act in the EU, but we also see other countries developing laws and other forms of regulation, or not in some contexts. But one of the questions is, again, about jurisdiction. So obviously, when anything goes online, what jurisdiction applies, what regulations apply. And that's really important, particularly when you have people crossing borders. And we see, in practice, we do see states applying different standards in different locations. And to me, that's highly concerning. And it's something that is highly problematic. In any unregulated area, there are lots of unknowns and questions, and this creates a lacuna for potential exploitation. And so one of the things in my work is to make sure that the protections of rights of the individuals, including the right to privacy, are respected. And I think it goes beyond that. And so one of the things I encourage your students to do is to go back, roll it right back to the principles that we want to stand by, and think about how those principles and best practices can be rolled into the AI space. So one of the things I advocate for is, of course, the rule of law and ideas and principles of humanity and dignity. And I think, how do we take that into the AI space for the people who are using it?
And I think that that's such a great way for us to think about AI in future. We tend, if you look at the media, to see so many negative stories about superintelligence, and if you speak to people about AI, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Maybe the Terminator, maybe these sorts of ideas of kind of media representations of AI that make us think of it in a certain way.
So I agree, and I would argue I'm quite an optimist in the context of my work, but I will say it's not a beautiful, pretty picture. And Dr. Oskal, in her research, she pulls out a really important point, which is that most of these systems are designed without migrants in mind. And that's really important. In fact, I'll give you some examples later, but I think it's something that I don't want you to think that this is a really positive space right now. It's not, from my perspective. However, there's huge potential.
How else do you think AI could be used as a tool for that sort of social justice for people in the field of migration that you're talking about, but also perhaps in other areas as well?
So how much control do we give to AI right now, in particular in the context of decision making? And I'm sure you've discussed this on the module, but should there be human oversight? Should the AI be making the decision? Should the humans be making the decision? How much human intervention do we have? And one example I wanted to give you is, in 2020, Norway rolled out a system for issuing legal residencies and citizenships. And it's done automatically by two so-called robots. I love that everyone names their robots, named Ada and Cal, I think it's how it's pronounced. And effectively, these automatically take decisions on applications. And if the decision is positive, then there is no human intervention. However, if the decision is negative, then human caseworkers get involved and they have to assess the case manually, which I find really interesting. And it's an interesting way or model of thinking about how we can protect the rights of individuals when cases are rejected. Is there a right to a appeal? Is there human intervention? And one of the challenges, though, is that sometimes we don't know how AI made the decision. So how do you review a decision, but we don't know on what basis it was made? So that's again about transparency. So really think about transparency, human intervention, and who's maintaining the oversight.
I wonder if from your experience you'd be happy to talk about how you think AI could be used as a tool for social justice in future, and actually how do we take those elements of humanity and dignity, and actually how do we create it into something that can be used for that purpose?
Thank you. It's such an important question because I do think AI can be used to advance social justice. And I think it has to be done in a much more holistic manner in order to achieve that. I mean, like any technology, AI can be used for good or bad. And if we think about how we can use it for good, we want to think about, in this context, we want to think about how we can help people who are fleeing persecution or conflict or other disasters, and think about how we can help them to reach safety, right? So I've rolled it right back to what am I doing, right? What is the purpose of our using AI? And when we think about that, it's like, how can we speed up processes? How can we make this easier and faster for governments, but also for the beneficiaries, the people who actually need help? How can we do it in a way that's fair and just? And how can we do this in a way that also, protects national security, which is a huge concern, and perhaps the elephant in the room that I haven't mentioned yet, but is something that we do need to consider. And the reason why I highlight that is because often national security is used to make the system more opaque. So we need to be careful how we navigate that. So in terms of social justice, I think it can be used to make legal migration pathways more accessible. And that means developing AI into different languages. So one of the other inequalities that we see in the development of AI is that AI is not available in every language. In fact, it's mostly available in English. And so when you have clients who speak minority languages where there's perhaps only 10,000 people in the world who speak it, I mean, this is not on Google Translate, let alone developed an AI. So how do we make that more accessible? So I think that's one way we can do it. And although a lot of the speech recognition technology developed has not been to the advantage of the migrants, we have seen one very positive example that I want to share. This was in Latvia, and they developed a speech recognition tool, which was to help applicants prepare for their citizenship applications. And I think that was and also to help them with matching in a resettlement process. So this is about trying to find the best place for them to be relocated to within Latvia. It's a really great example of when speech recognition tools are used to help the migrant in the process. And so again, this speaks to who we're helping and what we're trying to achieve in our social justice. So that's a really interesting example. And another example, which I'm so glad I did this discussion, because you made me circle back and go and see how this project is going. And they have rolled it out, and it's a great organization. So Haya Zahid, who is a lawyer in Pakistan, she runs an NGO called the Legal Aid Society. And they have just rolled out a chatbot which provides legal assistance. It's called the NAS Assist. And I did test it out this morning. I asked it a few questions to see how it went. And it provides legal guidance in 4 languages. So in English, Urdu, Pashto, and Sindhi, which I think is just phenomenal. It's a great example of how we can use AI technology in the context of migration to help migrants get a better understanding of what the laws are, what the rules are, and how they can navigate them. Again, I really want to stress that we want to, in this context, we want to advocate for legal pathways. We don't want people to be forced into illegal migration. And that means we need to have accessible legal pathways for people who are fleeing. And so this kind of technology can be used to really help them. But again, I would advance the idea that governments shouldn't be the only people rolling this out, and that the NGO sector really needs to try and learn and educate themselves, but also have the means and accessibility to do so.
And I think it's such an interesting example with NAS Assist, and I'll put it up onto Moodle for our students to have a look at as well and to explore. I really like your point about AI for the beneficiaries of it, but the beneficiaries not just being governments or organizations and companies. And as you said that, I felt something click in me, and I realized I hadn't thought about any of the systems that we're talking about in the context of refugees and migrants as something that's inherently beneficial for them. And what you're touching on is almost this human-centered design approach about design it for the people that will benefit from it, and actually engage in kind of empathizing and ideating and making it work for them. That feels like such a positive way of thinking about the future of AI in all contexts linked to social justice, but particularly the ones that you've mentioned as well.
So it's not only about language, but there's also access to technology. And there's a really interesting example in Sri Lanka where, and this is not AI specific, but they rolled out a social benefits system which required you to have a telephone. And not everyone has a smartphone and could access the system. And so again, it's about technology, right? So we need to make sure people have access to the technology needed to engage with these AI systems. But then also, I'm going to take it one step further. We need to think about older persons, particularly when we have populations where older populations who are even less educated on this kind of technology. And also, we want to think about persons with disabilities. So I don't know if you've engaged with that, but some of my clients are visually impaired. So we communicate through voice messages, and then I write up their application. So what kind of accommodations are we making for that particular group in relation to AI? And again, what assumptions is the AI making which don't apply to this individual? How can AI accommodate in its logic, in inverted commas? How can it address that? So I just wanted to add those points on. I also want to talk about empathy in relation to human intervention. So not only should we have human intervention in terms of protection and rights and making sure that we don't give too much control to the technology that's not transparent and overseen. What is the human component in this? So in terms of the casework I do, I interview every single client I have, at least on the phone, if not with a video call. Other caseworkers I know use automated questions. And one of the things that I feel quite strongly about is empathy, human empathy, is to what extent, within, particularly in this context, but others as well, is there a value in being heard? So one of the things my clients often say to me is, whatever the outcome of my application, thank you for listening to me. Because often it's the first time someone has listened to their very difficult story from beginning to end and asked questions and interrogated it and tried to support them. And so again, I think about the principles within social justice that we want to advance and take that forward.
Yeah, thank you, Imogen. I think that's a really important set of points. And I think we've covered a lot today around humanity, dignity, respect. And these are really important virtues that we want AI to have, I think, both now and in the future. I think one of the things we're trying to do on this course is really teach students, almost regardless of their discipline, how they can play that role and how they can be an active participant in how we're developing these future AIs. And I think that's a lovely point, perhaps, for us to finish on, is that kind of call for criticality when you're using these systems, and intentionality as well. Intentionally try to use these for positive outcomes. But Imogen, thank you so much. I think it's been a really interesting insight into your work, into the role that AI plays, and actually some of those wider challenges around AI and social justice. So thank you so much for joining us, and have a lovely rest of the day.
Thank you.